One of the subjects that legal historians have written about and argued about a lot is that of feudal courts. By feudal courts, I would take it to be meant a sort of court that derives from lordship. You could have a lord having a court which needn't derive from lordship. It could be a right granted to him by a king, or he could have usurped a local jurisdiction of some sort. But a feudal court suggests to me that it derives from his position of lord in relation to his followers, and in particular the people who hold the fiefs, the feus, from him. And that is the inherent element essential to a court being feudal. Would that fit with your understanding of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the multiplicity of sources of lordship, so that can come from, like you say, the usurpation of public powers. It can come from control over your household servants, but it can come from the followers that you grant lands to. And I think one element I would add to the understanding of feudal courts is that there are a lot of them, and part of the intrinsic definition of a feudal court is that it represents its own, theoretically it represents its own island of sovereignty and jurisdiction that can be contrasted with other similar courts.
Yes, I think certainly in England you will get some sort of ideal type of a feudal court in some sense as being sovereign. It is a world where a lord has followers who hold lands from him and who have a court where their business is sorted out. In practice, this is almost inevitably going to be more complicated than that. Lords, I think, want to have courts. It's a sign of status, a sign of control. They will try and control those courts, but the courts will be made up of their followers, but also quite possibly other people, not just the landholders from them, people who hold lands from them, but also people of importance in the area. How far they act in a sovereign fashion is very hard to tell, or how far they form part of just the general ruling of England after the Norman conquest, that lords are helping the king rule his country, and the king will interfere or become involved at their request as much as at the discontented vassals' request. It's unclear. Certainly, though, there does seem to be a pattern whereby kings seem to formalise and control the activities of lords' courts, possibly as early as the first half of the 12th century with Henry I, but particularly from the reign of Henry II onwards. And the continuing jurisdiction of the lords' courts, particularly over matters of property, is very much controlled by royal procedures from the 1170s, 1180s onwards. Is that dissimilar to what happens in France?
I think so. I mean, one of the big differences between France and England is the different rates of the revival of royal power and the success of royal power. In part, this is geographical. France is much bigger and harder to rule. But the royal power in France grows in a much more piecemeal fashion. Does this mean that feudal courts are necessarily in opposition with royal justice? That's a much more difficult question to answer, but it's certainly been seen by some historians that very much is the narrative, one of conflict between lords and kings. But I think, the idea of sovereignty you mentioned earlier, the fact that these courts may be made up of people from all over the place, and I think that's one of the ways in which we can dismantle this idea that the ideal typical feudal court is one where the lord just imposes his will. And that's a useful way of thinking about France, certainly, and we see a circulation of personnel in these different courts, some of which may have relationships with the crown, some of which may not, but it may be better to think of a legal culture orientated around lordship as opposed to feudal courts as sovereign units.
So in the end, would you avoid using the term feudal courts in discussions of the legal history of France?
I would prefer seigneurial courts because it has the resonance with ideas of lordship, which need not be defined exclusively in terms of the grant of a fief to a vassal, And I think it recognises the multiplicity of how these jurisdictions develop. Would you agree with that for England, or do you think that feudal courts remain a useful nomenclature?
I remain happy with the nomenclature because it shows the tightness of the connection between landholding, lordship, and jurisdiction. And I think to tie the three of those together, which may be a product as much of the Norman conquest, and particularly English conditions, as of some abstract feudalism, but I think for England, probably actually for elsewhere, I'd remain content with the use of the phrase feudal courts.